So Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the kind of game where sometimes a staple can be broken in a certain format and then irrelevant the next one. The reason for that isn't necessarily because the card becomes bad itself, but rather because people are adapting themselves to new meta trends. For example, if Rescuers players are all choosing to play Jet Synchron in their deck to make Borrowed Savage Dragon and Baron de Fleur, then Super Poly and Dragon Knight Draco Equist randomly become really good and popular in the format. But then if people are choosing to go with different lines of play to play around the Super Poly, then people might actually replace Super Poly with hand traps. And sometimes decks randomly gain or lose in popularity because of the resurgence or lack of certain hand traps. For example, if Droll and Logbird is popular in the metagame, then Unchained is going to gain a lot of popularity as well. That deck really doesn't lose to Droll and Logbird because it barely has to search anything from deck to hand, so, it's obviously really good in a Droll format. The same could be said about Nibiru, and obviously both Droll and Nibiru are pretty bad against Labyrinth, so you can expect a lot of trap decks in formats where people play the high impact hand traps. But if these high impact hand traps are not seeing too much play, then you can expect really hardcore combo decks like Infernoble and Dark World to start seeing in play. These decks don't really lose to low impact hand traps such as Ash and Imperm, unlike the other mid-range-esque decks. But to be quite honest with you, regardless of the format that we're in and the environment, there's always going to be at least 5 different decks and the same hand traps that are played every time. So Ash and Imperm, basically regardless of the metagame, you will always see them. What might change, however, would be the other non-engine cards that might be a little more niche. How about Book of Moon? Is that card still worth playing, or is it past its time? In case you didn't know, Book of Moon was extremely good last format because it was an answer to both Kashtira as well as Purely when they were using their trap card to target the monster to summon the Noir. And obviously, since Kashtira and Purely were the 2 best decks of the format, it goes without saying that Book of Moon and Book of Eclipse were extremely good. With that said though, things are now quite different. The most powerful combo decks in the game right now are Mana Dome and Infernoble, and they really don't care about books or board breakers in general. At least not if they're going first. The fact that both of these decks can put up Omni Negates is actually kind of problematic and makes your board breakers never really trade for resources very well. So when you're going second in Yu-Gi-Oh! In general, you always start with a drastic disadvantage, and that's the reason why you want to trade 1 for 2 instead of just 1 for 1. For each one of your cards, you want to beat 2 of your opponent's cards, which is the reason why cards like Ultimate Slayer are sometimes much better. Because if a card like Dark Ruler No More gets negated by something like Mana Dome Reframing in the Mana Dome strategy or Angelica's Angelic Ring against Infernoble, you're kind of left with nothing. Whereas on the other hand, Ultimate Slayer guarantees that you're at least dumping a card from your extra deck to the graveyard, which can trigger its graveyard effect to keep breaking your opponent's board even if the Ultimate Slayer itself gets negated. Now, Ultimate Slayer is basically just a side deck card, whereas Book of Moon can be main decked, and that really plays into its appeal. Book of Moon could be used as a defensive card when you're going first, since you can obviously just set it, and certain decks might not lose to Veil or Imperm, but do lose to Book of Moon. The bad news is, it is really bad against Unchained because they can just destroy their face-down monsters and keep playing. And the only really good application that it had from before would be against Purely, and obviously that deck is losing quite a lot in popularity right now, which makes Book of Moon a little less good. I'd say Book of Moon is still a pretty good and safe card to play because obviously it's a really good card going first and second, but it's not on the same level as before again, so I would keep an eye out on it, but I wouldn't necessarily play it in any deck. And obviously what I just said applies both to Book of Moon and Book of Eclipse. The only difference between both is that Eclipse loses to Ash and it's worse going first because it might make your opponent draw a bunch of cards on the end phase. Alright, next up on the discussion is Kashtira Fenrir. Just how good is it right now? The card sounds much better than Book of Moon on paper because it's really good going first and second, obviously, since it is an interruption when you're going first and a board breaker when you're going second. Where it looks much better is that you can actually search Fenrir with Fenrir, which makes it so that you always have a +1 on top of an interruption. And Fenrir, unlike Book of Moon, allows you to kind of keep playing the game generically even when you don't really have access to your engine, because worst case you can just normal summon an Ash and make a Baron de Fleur, or use that as a link material for like SP Little Knight, and then when you tag out you can summon the Fenrir again and just keep playing. The main reason why Fenrir is seeing so much in play is obviously because of the fact that its effect is actually good, but it's especially because of the fact that it can search itself. The card being limited almost translates to it being banned because I can't really imagine a lot of players are choosing to play one Fenrir in their deck. Now, there is one major drawback with Fenrir, and I don't think a lot of players are really well aware of it. So Fenrir is always the first summon that you have to conduct, and unfortunately, that might make you randomly play into Nibiru. For example, if you were to play Fenrir in Unchained, it might just make some of your combo sequences a little worse. Unfortunately, the issue that I have with Fenrir is that more often than not, it just feels like a forced inclusion in a deck just for like extra banishes with pretty much no real strategy. And that's why it's important to play Fenrir only in decks that can directly benefit off of it. I'm not the biggest fan of Fenrir in decks like Unchained, but I actually think it's really good in decks like Mana Dome or Labyrinth. So in Mana Dome, obviously, you get to search the Scareclaw Kashtira, and that kind of gets your engine going because it makes the link 1. In Labyrinth, it gets to search you another Fenrir, and then you can use it as a discard fodder for your furniture monsters. Not to mention that Fenrir does apply pressure on your opponent, so even if you are getting hit by Lightning Storm or Duster, you can still, be a threat to your opponent. And Fenrir actually is really good in tier elements because not only does it search tier elements Kashtira, which is an extender, but also if you are getting shifted, at least you are ending with Fenrir, and it's an interruption at the worst case. Fenrir does have the potential to be really good in rescues because you could build around it. So for example, you could actually play the Kashtira field spell, then search Fenrir, search another Fenrir, and then you discard the Fenrir for the Diabell Star, and you send the Kashtira field spell or your Snake Eye spell card. So yeah, keep all of that in mind if you are on the fence of whether or not you want to play the card. Now, the last cards I wanted to touch on would be the infamous Triple Tactic Talent and Thrust. What I find funny about these cards is that players have a tendency to change their mind about them just as often as they change underwear. One day they're broken and ban-worthy, and the other day, well, they just suck. Now, even though they both look very similar, they function completely differently. Talents is generally playable in pretty much any deck that isn't a trap deck, and it only really functions when your opponent uses a monster effect on your main phase. Even under Droll, Talents can still be really good because you can still look at your opponent's hand and make him lose a card, and even if Droll wasn't even a part of the equation whatsoever, this would still be the best effect of the card anyways. The worst case scenario with Talents is when you get hit by like Imperm or Shifter on standby, or when your opponent doesn't have a hand trap and you kinda need your Talents to do something. But honestly, it usually does not disappoint too much. However, this card does not single-handedly fix the issues of your deck because it doesn't really negate hand traps. It's not like a Call by the Grave. It's only really good if your deck is already resilient and already plays through hand traps. So honestly, some of the best decks at being able to use Triple Tactic Talents would be Unchained and Purely. Now, Thrust on the other hand is, again, like I said, completely different. Now, even if you get shifted, Thrust is very good, but under Droll, Thrust is kinda bad. All you're really doing is set a normal trap or normal spell card from your deck to your field, and honestly, you're basically never going to be setting a normal spell. And setting a normal trap looks cool and all, but unless you're setting something like a Dimensional Barrier, it's kinda just mediocre. Most players who are main decking Triple Tactic Thrust don't really have any interesting normal trap card targets for it, at least in game 1. So if they get hit by a hand trap when the opponent does not control a monster, usually they're just setting like infinite impermanence. And that's like really bad. But going second, Thrust is infinitely better than Talents because it basically translates to searching any blowout card in the game. But then again, you cannot always rely on the best case scenario when you deck build. People who are now dropping Thrust from their deck are now realizing that, and that's the reason why you are seeing less Thrust and Talents this format. Because I remember when Unchained just came out, everybody was playing like a bunch of Talents and Thrust in that deck. Or sometimes I even find deck lists who are only playing like one copy of each, which is honestly not that much. Anyways, the goal of this video wasn't necessarily to influence you to play a card or not, but rather to make you think on whether or not it is correct in your strategy. Either way, the answer to these questions will change very soon once we get more product or a ban list down the line. Anyways, that's all I had for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys very soon. Peace.